Hi, my name is Jan Rigsby, and this is a short video presentation on Patrick Lecture 81, which is the topic for April 2017, and it is conflicts in the world of duality. And my intention here is to very lightly go over the 4 sections of the lecture. So when I present a study guide, which are posted on my websites, I break the lecture into 4 portions. And every week, I invite people to take a look at that portion. And that allows for the lecture to be present during a whole month instead of a day or an evening. And during a whole month, questions come up that might not come up from a 2-hour period of time or even a 1-week period of time. So that's my intention in this video. The 4 sections in this video that I highlighted, I all related them back to fear of death. And the reason I did that is that when you say conflicts in the world of duality, it's important to understand what duality is. So duality in the Pathwork teachings is a way of unconsciously or consciously dividing a situation into, this is what I want, this will make me happy, this will fulfill me, this is life affirming. Or, I don't want this, it's not going to make me happy. It's not going to affirm my life, it's going to diminish my life, therefore this other choice is death. So to be simplistic about it, one choice represents some form of life affirming process. And the other choice involves death or diminishment of our essence. When you try to analyze a situation, you may not see life and death. You may only see one of the two. So if you imagine for me, if there's a magnet, you've got a positive and a negative side of a magnet. You may not experience both sides at the same time. If you experience one, what this lecture is inviting to bring to the surface is that one represents an attraction, a move away from the other. So if you see something that is life affirming, you're moving away from death, even if it's invisible. If you perceive something as diminishing, meaning death, you're looking towards life, even if it's vague. Anything is better than death. So another way of saying that is that the survival instinct in man, the physical survival instinct, also exists on an emotional, mental, and even spiritual level, where we imagine more life-affirming versus deadly aspects of being. And our survival instinct kicks in on any or all of those levels. So I'm going to give some examples from things that people have expressed during the monthly meetings, and I'm going to show you the paradox, the way seeing something as life-affirming, if you hang on to it too long, it becomes death. So here are some examples. So what if death is being shamed or humiliated? That would begin, that fear of shame and humiliation might begin as a life-affirming process of being someone that others approve of. Now remember, this all begins in childhood, where we're thinking very simplistically. So if I am someone that is approved of, I feel loved, I feel cherished, I feel important, I feel part of the family. Naturally, this is life-affirming. So the other stuff, whatever it is, that's death. Now, if you take this childlike appreciation for approval and allow it to just become part of your personality, part of how you operate in the world, then you wind up, and I'm exaggerating, but exaggeration helps distinguish these points. If you allow that childish desire for approval to become part of your personality, as you go forward and you become, let's say, a 40-year-old person, you may find that you're still attached to seeking approval. And you're still secretly or openly terrified of humiliation. And what happens is you've painted yourself into a corner. You've gotten yourself into a box. And this thing that used to make you feel alive can wind up making you feel like you're dying. I'm being smothered. I can't breathe. I can't be myself. Every time I try to break through, somebody disapproves of me and I cringe in fear. So this is how something that started out as life-affirming can, in its simplicity, wind up being a prison, a box that becomes deadly to the expansion and development of your personality. Another example. Death is having to see parts of me that I am ashamed of. Well, as a child, it might start out as sensitivity. I am sensitive to your needs. I can see what you really want, and so I will respond supportively to what you truly want. And I can see what I want, so I can almost invisibly take care of myself. Isn't that wonderful? And then once again, 40 years later, we think that that's only useful for the good. And we don't realize that sometimes that sensitivity is very useful in also finding parts that need development. So we have taken our ability to be sensitive and we've kept it simplistic and superficial. And when it manifests itself by seeing the parts of us we don't like, we become frightened and upset. And we jump back into, I'll just be sensitive. But sensitive is a double-edged sword. What I'm stressing here is, as a mature adult, we need to develop our capabilities rather than rely upon the good side or how they work in a positive vein. We need to recognize a larger picture, a larger perspective. And if we run from that and insist on only seeing the good stuff, we limit our life. We limit our ability to deal with situations. And when I say these death is, one of the exercises that I invited people to participate in on their own, and also sometimes in the meetings, is to say death is and finish the sentence. And if you say that 20 times, and you can write it or record it, but it's most powerful when you say it, because people, a partner or a group, can say, come on, finish the sentence, and we get the Freudian slip. Death is, and we reveal something that we weren't fully aware of. And that's part of what we work with in pathwork, is to bring up semi-conscious beliefs that contradict who we think we are, who we want to be. Now, I'm going to, and this may or may not work, I'm going to go to a share screen in this video teleconference of a diagram that I created for this purpose. And what it shows is how I'm describing unconscious beliefs can hold you back. So if you can imagine there's a positive result, and that's safety and happiness, which is life, and you're in the little boat and you're headed towards that. And on the on the horizon are the rocks, and that's the negative result, the danger, unhappiness, death. And you're desperately trying to paddle or swim or sail away from the rocks, but you can't make any headway. And the suggestion is that what's holding you back is an unconscious belief that contradicts your conscious beliefs. And the analogy I'm using here is a sea anchor, which is a big cloth bag that when you throw it overboard, fills with water and drags down into the water and is extremely efficient at holding a boat steady in the open water. And that can be how our unconscious beliefs feel like they are pulling us back. Of course, the dilemma is they're unconscious. So we have the conscious beliefs on the surface and the unconscious beliefs that we're not fully aware of, and they're in contradiction. These can also be repressed needs and feelings that manifest as compulsions, uncontrollable urges, lust for power or pleasure. Now, I use the word lust for power and pleasure because everyone wants power and pleasure. But if it is repressed, it becomes adamant. It becomes insistent. It becomes determined. I'm going to get it at any cost. So the desire for power and pleasure, which would seem life-affirming, can actually become deadly when it is the only purpose, the only objective, instead of power for the sake of others, for the sake of a generic happiness, and pleasure at all costs instead of what most adults have to do to get through the day. A little pleasure, little chores. Let me stop that. So these examples of what death is, gleaned from the meetings that we've had, and gleaned from the invitation to say, death is, death is, death is, and finish the sentence without thinking, without your ego trying to make it pretty. Let me give you a few other examples. Death is being overwhelmed by others. This may have come when you were a child from feeling a little lonely or disconnected and finding that family gatherings, the energy of family embrace, made you feel whole, it made you feel happy, it made you feel safe. Once again, if you invisibly focus on that too much and that becomes an overwhelming part of your life, you may find 40 years later that it begins to feel suffocating. I never have any time to myself. I'm constantly surrounded by family. But when you try to step out of that, you haven't developed the coping mechanisms, the ability to manage solitude. So because that feels uncomfortable, you leap back in to the embrace of the family. So to describe these kinds of things, I advocated the use of a tool called the vicious circle. Now, the vicious circle is Patrick Lecture 50, and it's a description that not only exists in pathwork, but I clip news articles and psychology, pop psychology articles, and the word vicious circle is common parlance. And the idea is that a vicious circle, and if somebody just joined our meeting, if you could mute your audio, please. I appreciate it, because I'm going to go through this presentation for about 20 more minutes. That a vicious circle is when you start doing something that is, let's call it unbalanced, just to give it a benign description. You start off and it's unbalanced. It works. It may work temporarily very, very well, but for the long term, it's unbalanced. And you start using this personality mechanism or this way of being in the world. And because you had success at first, you just stick with it. And then it stops working. In a vicious circle, what happens is you just try harder. I know this works. It worked for me before. If I try harder, I can get back my previous success. I can regain pleasure, which is life-affirming. and push away these uncomfortable feelings that there's something wrong. So we try harder and try harder. But because we're focusing too much on one element of ourselves and not a balanced approach to life or a balanced personality, this is not going to work out. Now, vicious circle describes when we are in a dysfunctional state. We can repeat things that work well over and over again. That's called a benign circle. It doesn't do any harm. It doesn't necessarily advance growth, but it doesn't do any harm. The reason we describe it as a vicious circle is we're working with an area of us that winds up becoming more and more dysfunctional. So the vicious circle is a tool that we can use for self-analysis to say, this happens and this happens and this happens, and then, oh my God, this happens again and again, and it happens again and again. And we can use this vicious circle to say, well, it happened when I was 13. It happened when I was 27. It happened last week. And it enables us to see a larger dysfunction than specific examples might indicate. And another tool for this is the daily review, which is Patrick Lecture 28. And it is a way of simply going through your day. And this can be done in just 5 minutes at night or 5 minutes in the morning. Of course, it can become a more extensive process. But just before you fall asleep, to just recount what happened during the day. And then the next day, recount what happened during the day. And at some point, you're going to notice repetition. And once you begin to notice a pattern, the invitation is to spend some time looking more deeply at that pattern. The benefit of that is that if you resolve an issue that has created a pattern of dysfunctionality in your life, you resolve so many things. You can gain so much relief from it that it's worth spending a lot of time on something that has become a pattern, rather than try to go after incident, which can lead you to be chasing the effects and never unearthing the cause. So let me give one or two other examples of this. So one person said death is trusting others, which sounds contradictory. But it may have begun when they were a child as an environment where adults could not be trusted, and that is an unfortunate reality. But if you can imagine being a child in an environment where your authority figures, your adults, the people who are supposed to keep you safe, can't be trusted, then not trusting is a very smart move. Not trusting becomes a way to survive. Now, you can easily imagine where 40 years later, you're a person who doesn't trust anyone. But you're not a child anymore. You're an adult, and an adult has the capacity to quit a job where their bosses and supervisors and coworkers are untrustworthy. And while there may be financial penalties to quitting a job, we have mobility. We have the ability to, in effect, leave home. Now, I'll tell a short story about my life to illustrate how a kid thinks and how later that doesn't work very well. We moved a lot. I was part of a military family, and my father was a very big man, very tall, very commanding. He was an officer. And we moved, I was 6. And we had moved probably 6 times since I was 6. And we moved to a new place. And I was miserable. It was the first or second day. My father was home during the day because he was helping my mother move in. And it was an apartment house instead of a house, and I was very unhappy. I remember standing on the stairwell at the bottom of one of the landings and looking up at my great big giant father, which, you know, this was very Freudian, very symbolic. So here I am, this little kid, and I'm yelling at my dad at the top of the stairs. And I said, "I don't want to live here." And my father, who had probably had enough, he had a lot on his plate. He boomed down the stairs at me and said, "Then move." He was not an unkind man. In that moment of frustration where for him it was ridiculous, so he was basically showing me, you just got to get along with other people in life. But that's not what he said. What he said was, move. And I remember to this day being on the landing and looking up at my father, and it makes me want to tear up even now. Kids can think. And I thought, where would I go? I'm in a strange city, in a strange land. I was literally in Europe. I don't speak the language. Where would I go? What would I do? And in that moment, my child survival instinct was head down, Stockholm syndrome, make it work, because you got no choice. This is it. This is life, and the option is death. Now, that can develop into a personality trait of perseverance, stubbornness, the ability to hold on to something and never let go. All these are wonderful. But it can also turn into a deep-seated fear of challenging authority. Because if I challenge authority, they'll show me an option that I can barely live with, and the other option is death. Now, you can't, as a parent, avoid this. It's part of human nature for kids to think up things that their parents don't realize they're thinking up. I use this example to illustrate how survival coping mechanisms in childhood can, if we're unaware of them, become dysfunctional aspects of us when we grow up. And the invitation here is to bring these to the surface, to uncover them. So part 2 of this segment was, I'll find this in my notes. So the first part was fear of death. The second part is a tendency to grab onto illusion, irrational beliefs. And to illustrate how we grab irrational beliefs as part of our coping mechanisms is it's a list of 11 that I got, and in the presentation notes I credit the person I got them from. I'm going to speak a few of them, and as I say them, your first impression will be, oh yeah, that makes sense. Your second impression may be, oh, that's not healthy. And that's the important thing, is they're irrational. First one of them is, it is absolutely necessary for me to be loved and approved of by nearly every person with whom I have close contact. I will repeat that without making mistakes. It is absolutely necessary for me to be loved and approved of by nearly every person with whom I have close contact. What that disguises is a life or death struggle that says disapproval is death. As an adult, if you can't handle disapproval, you're going to have problems in the real world, because people do disapprove in large and small ways of what we do. This also leads to a life-affirming hanging on, where we only do the things other people approve of. We only do the things that will get us love from our close connections. There's nothing wrong with that. It's the word only that is the problem. Another one is, I must be thoroughly competent and adequate in all respects, or I'm worthless. No one is competent all the time. No one. No one is adequate all the time. It is important to be honest about ourselves, to admit when we're incompetent or inadequate, without going into the histrionic drama of I am worthless. And the histrionic drama, the exaggeration, I am worthless, can be a secret appeal to people, because of course they're going to say, oh no, you're not worthless. And that's what we're seeking. We want to be brought back in. So the exaggeration of I am worthless is even an attempt to be accepted and embraced. Last one is, unhappiness is caused by external events over which I have almost no control. Unhappiness is caused by external events over which I have almost no control. Unhappiness is sometimes caused by conflicts within yourself. It is true that there are some events that happen externally that create unhappiness that you may not be able to control in any way whatsoever. However, what is missing here is that happiness and unhappiness is something that we have total and complete control of. I decide if I am unhappy. I can be uncomfortable. I can be sitting in a seat and become uncomfortable. And I may feel I have to stand up or move or wiggle. But if I can't stand up and move to another seat, if I'm just stuck in an uncomfortable seat, I can suck it up. I can say, it's uncomfortable. I'm going to have to be here for 45 more minutes. I'm going to have to cope. I'll have to manage. And what that does is that can enable me to not be unhappy, even though I am not happy. Part of the lesson of learning dualistic thinking is that just because you're not happy doesn't mean you're unhappy. It doesn't go, like there's a curved scale, like a rainbow, and one side is happy and the other side is unhappy. Not being happy does not mean you're unhappy. Not being happy may mean I'm here. I really want to be here, but I'm here. In a lot of life, there's a wide range of levels of happiness. And there's a lot of not happiness before you get to unhappiness. So unhappiness is caused by external events over which I have almost no control, is irrational because the controller of happiness is inside. So those are some examples of irrational beliefs that can lead us to black and white analysis of situations, which is dualistic thinking. The third section was another paradoxical segment of the lecture, and that is that we can also have a fear of bliss. Now, you may have heard of fear of success. It's the same kind of paradox. Let me go after fear of success first. We can fear success because we have an inner knowing that if we succeed, we're going to be more exposed. And if we're more exposed, meaning seen, we're going to write more papers, we're going to stand in front of more audiences, we're going to be involved in more decision-making processes. If we succeed, we will be more exposed. And the parts of us that are not fully developed, let's be generous, not fully developed versus undeveloped, those parts will be exposed. So a fear of success can be about, not the success, we'd really like that, but an inner knowing what will happen if we succeed. In other words, fear of success is fear of success that's not earned and deserved and supported by our own hard work, so that we are exposed as frauds. Now, fear of bliss, how does that relate? The lecture says, the original longing is for happiness supreme. But life on earth prohibits such fulfillment. This prohibition creates the world of duality and therefore your conflict. So as I said with the range of happy, unhappy, we want bliss, but we're not going to get it every day, every moment. We may only get a taste of bliss occasionally. And what we do is we wind up being afraid of that because we don't know it. I know this sounds paradoxical, but if you desire to inhabit a state of bliss, but you honestly don't know what that means, you may decide, I think I'll stay over here. This is not bad. Yes, I know I'm supposed to say I want bliss, but emotionally, internally, I don't know what that means. So that we wind up having a fear of success, bliss, intimacy, where we say the words, I want intimacy. But like the diagram that I showed with that sea anchor, yeah, but what does that mean? If I was intimate with someone, wouldn't they see I'm not perfect? Wouldn't they see I'm unworthy? So on the surface, we mouth the words, yes, intimacy is wonderful and relationship is great and I want to succeed. But internally, we can harbor even a terror of those goals. So it is important to get that to the surface so we can work on it. If we work on the areas that we are not developed in, then we won't be as afraid to be seen, heard, and to create effects on the world. And the last part of this lecture, it's like we do these 4 sections and we're working around the core of the lecture. The last section is clinging to life. So the lecture says, you superimpose ready-made answers, which may even be true as such, but they are not true for you because you have not arrived at them out of strength and courage that come only through facing the issue, but rather by avoiding it out of fear and weakness. Now, you can see there's a similarity here to fear of bliss. This is the other angle of it, that sometimes when we cling to dysfunction, it's as if that's all I can afford to have. If I let go of this and I reach for bliss, I could lose everything. So we wind up clinging to what we have. Now, this is not a well-rounded, open, loving, emotional position to be in. And that's what the lecture is suggesting. And it actually says, he who knows how to die knows how to live. Meaning, if I walk around all day long being afraid of dying, physically, emotionally, mentally, professionally, spiritually. If every minute of every day, the only thing in my mind is, oh my God, I'm going to die. Oh my God, I'm going to be hurt. Oh my God, I'm going to be rejected. Oh my God, I'm going to be fired. Oh my God, God won't love me. If that preoccupies my mind, I'm not living. I'm not exploring. I'm not welcoming experiences that will expose the areas that I need to develop and say, thank you for bringing that to my attention. Apparently, I need to do some work here. Okay. And the guide says, that's what he who knows how to die knows how to live. He who does not know how to die cannot live. And the kind of death we're speaking of here, even though there is a physical death possible, it's the death of the ego, the death of the illusion, the death of what pathwork terms is the idealized self-image, the mask that we wear to look good to other people. When that mask dies, we are seen, we have the potential to be seen for who we really are instead of who we're pretending to be. So the suggestion that I make is, that's in the lecture, is to find an area of your being that clings to life simply to avoid death. Where are you holding something because you're afraid of dying? Now, holding can be a very gentle thing. I was taught once when they were teaching me to make strokes in massage training, massage therapy training. They said, you can use your fists, but you must use your fists gently. And here was the energetic that they taught me. They said, pretend that you've got a small bird in your hand. And as you press your strokes, make sure you don't hurt the bird. And what that does, it allows you to use the leverage of your knuckles and your bones, but there's an intent there that is different than if you just take your fist and shove it. So instead of clinging to life, making a fist and squeezing all the life out of it, you can hold life gently and lovingly and let it live, let it move. So those are some of the points that were made in the lecture that I wanted to bring out. Also, as I told the group that is listening, when I go through and facilitate and listen to people and how they work with the lecture, it deepens my understanding of the lecture. So I take great pleasure in hearing others. So right now, I'm going to invite the people who are listening, 4 or 5 people, if there are any questions they have that they want recorded for the presentation, to go ahead and ask. And if they don't have any questions, then we'll complete this. You guys are going to have to unclick your mute buttons.
I do have a question.
Yes, go ahead.
During your presentation, you mentioned a couple other pathwork lectures. How do the pathwork lectures relate to one another?
It's a really good question. I have no choice but to go to what the guide said. When the lectures were first being presented, they seemed to be an explanation rather than giving exercises and working with us on a personality level. It seemed to be that the guide was simply explaining, this is how the universe was created, this is how things work, this is the larger picture. I'm paraphrasing, of course, but give or take around lecture 23 or 25, the guide began to say things like, this isn't working. we have to deal with this on an emotional, experiential level rather than just intellectually. The other thing the guide said was that Eva Parakos, presented the lectures while in trance. She says it was another voice, believe what you will. But that voice, which we call the guide, said that he was actually the spokesperson for a team who wanted to bring information to humanity, to help humanity. So give or take around lecture 25, the focus of the lectures shifted. And they began to work on how people operate and how the way we operate can go into distortion. And the third part of that was examined more fully later in the lectures. So I'm going to say it now, but there was from 25 to about 165, the focus was on human nature, how human nature operates, how we react to authority and parents, how we react in relationship, how we react to God from the human perspective. And then the guide began to enlarge that and talk about how we as human beings are responding to our own spiritual development, meaning that we are focusing our attention on what doesn't work, when a lot of other things may work wonderfully, meaning that our divine nature is much greater than our, I'll use the word puny, human experience may illustrate, but that we were squeezing ourselves down in order to focus on a dysfunctional false belief, misconception, or distortion. Now, to go to your question, what is the organizational structure of the lectures? The guide once again said that the team that he was representing didn't make up their mind about exactly what to talk about until Eva had gone into trance after the groups who gathered to hear were assembled. That does not mean it was ad-libbed or ad hoc, but there was attention paid to who was in the room and what their developmental level was. Now, from my perspective, so in theory, the answer to your question is there's no organization. That's not true. But there wasn't an ABC process. However, there was an ABC process because the group solidified and the group became more constant and new people kept coming in and the pathwork community grew and grew so that there was an intent to lead people through a long process. Exactly what was said and exactly the order of the lectures is beyond my comprehension. Now, the next part of that for me is a debate that people have, and that is, should I read them in the order they were given? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 28, 29, 30. My invitation is based upon this. It was 25 years ago when I was first working with pathwork. I was a normal person, and I didn't believe in angels, and I didn't believe in the human auric system. I didn't believe in a lot of things, and I certainly didn't believe in channeling. And the invitation made by my teachers was, don't worry about it. If the information is useful, right? If the information is useful, use it. If it's not, let it go. So in my first year of pathwork studies, I remember seeing a bus. This was in Los Angeles, which is kind of new agey. I remember seeing a bus with an advertisement that presumed two angels talking to each other. And I looked at that and I thought, pathwork is not a niche thing. Spirituality is not a niche thing. When an advertiser pays to have a spiritual context used to advertise their mouthwash or whatever it was, then there's something happening in the wider world that may not be as obvious as it is when you meet with spiritual groups, New Age groups. So, still trying to answer the question. Since the lectures were delivered, and she did the channeling from 1956 until 1979, so that's 24 years. Since 1979, there's been a lot of time. And a lot of this work, not only from the path work, but from the very large number of other channeling groups, religious groups that have changed their focus and become more integrative. Society has moved forward on this. So to answer your question, there may have been a specific order to the lectures for a specific purpose at that time. That does not mean that we today need to go through that same process. We may have, and this is based on the science of the 100 monkey syndrome, that after something has been in society for a length of time, there's an intuitive acceptance or knowing of it. We may not need some of these lectures that people needed in 1959 or 1975. That knowledge may have filtered into society so that we read it like a news article. Yeah, got it. So my invitation in terms of the order the lectures are in are based on, and I have this on my website, there are some basic principles that will tell you whether you like pathwork or you don't. So you can, quick overview to see if this is what you want, because there are many, many places to do self-development work. And then I recommend what I call spiritual roulette. And that is, take a list of the lectures, glance through them, and see what pops off the page to you. So in terms of, is there an order to the lectures? Yes, there was. Yes, there can be. You can choose to go through them numerically if you choose. Pathwork regions that offer formal four-year programs do not go through the lectures sequentially. We select them based on a generic learning for each year that hopefully has a larger overview. And they can range from 1 to 258 during a single year, depending on what aspect we're trying to teach at that point. I'm going to check in with you, Dennis. Did that answer your question?
That's part one. Part two would be, when you read one lecture, there are other lectures that seem to relate directly. Mm-hmm. And so that there seems to be like a cluster of lectures scattered throughout the whole canon of pathwork that seem to relate in some way. Is that correct?
Yes. I was saying to somebody the other day, repetition is not a crime. We need to hear a similar teaching, I don't know, 300 times, 500 times, before it completely sinks in. So the lectures offer a certain concept on varying different levels. This is how the concept looks in terms of personality. This is how the concept looks in terms of relationship. This is how the concept looks in terms of religion and political systems. This is how the concept looks on a spiritual relationship to God. There are many, many different levels. And on the key concepts, there might be 2 or 3 lectures on each one of those levels. So again, the key for me is the titles of the lectures are very well chosen. They're remarkable. I don't know who did it, but they did a really good job. They do reflect what's in the lecture for the most part. However, I have found that there is sometimes an aside inside a lecture that isn't visible from the title or even a snippet. There's a sidebar that the teachings go on that is critical for me. So I'll read the lecture, go through it, but that paragraph takes me in a whole different direction. And my invitation is, that's why you don't want to be looking for that paragraph, because that's like going through life looking for the perfect afternoon. Rather, you want to make arrangements that seem amenable to you, that seem to work with you where you are on subjects you're interested in, and allow yourself to be drawn in deeper, to work with the positive desire for self-development and transformation, rather than trying to construct a course on personal development. So here's a paradox. Until you know yourself, you can't design that course. And after you know yourself, you don't need that course. So no one knows what you need but you. I can suggest generic courses of study for people. It's always generic because it's like lightning. You never quite know where it's going to hit. Let me check in with you again, Dennis.
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay. Any other questions before I close this part, and then we can go on with our normal meeting? Okay.
I have a question, Jan.
Yes, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question.
Mm-hmm.
We said that we needed to expose ourselves now in order to see, in order to our ego to die.
Mm-hmm.
See, you know, the parts that we needed to working on.
Mm-hmm.
But how can you know, like, when you're going to do this? Because my problem is, if we expose ourselves all the time, we're going to become vulnerable, no? To expose us to situations or people that we shouldn't be exposed to. So how are we going to, you understand, like, because it requires some kind of rationality or making decisions.
Right.
And so can you like talk more about that, please?
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Elenise. I think what your question involves is the potential for becoming overly vulnerable. Okay. The key to this is that this is an internal process first. Okay. You want a handle on this before you start taking it out in the world. So instead of, well, let me give you a story. When I was a child, there was a poem that I loved. I don't know why I loved it, except it probably had to do with me on a spiritual level in a way that I didn't understand until 40, 50 years later. And the poem went something like this. Little Joe Tunney, who tried to be funny, but nobody laughed. And it tells the story of Joe, who kept trying to be the center of attention, and it wasn't working. And one day his dad took him to the circus, and he jumped into the ring and tried to be the entertainer, and nobody applauded. And then the elephant picked Joe up by his trousers and put him back in his seat. And Joe was quiet for the rest of the performance. Now that can sound sad. Poor Joe. He was humiliated and embarrassed in front of all those people. But for some reason, little Joe Tunney, who tried to be funny, has rung through my brain for over 60 years. The meaning to me is don't try to entertain. Number one, that's not my skill. Can I be entertaining? Yes. But don't try to entertain. If you have something to deliver, if you have a gift to present, sometimes it's a message where people laugh a lot. Comedians deliver very deep messages. But that needs to be organic to your being. I need to walk through that. So you don't want to get into a situation where you're exposed to too large an audience when you're not capable of supporting that audience. You want to start modestly and build up your capacity. Okay? Now, personally, overexposing yourself, another way of describing this is, I think Carolyn Mice used the word woundology. Woundology, where we walk up to someone and say, I'm damaged by abuse in my childhood. What are you damaged by? And we're comparing wounds. We're overexposing ourselves. Okay? That also is inappropriate. It's going to lead to hurt feelings and a feeling of being damaged and victimized because the other person may not be able to handle that level of deep sharing. So again, this process is internal. The process of realizing who we are is about personally realizing something. Like you've got a little book here and you go, yeah, I see that. Yeah, okay. And then you put it away and then you practice self-development. You practice being more open. If it doesn't work, you go back to your observation and say, that didn't work, so let's adjust. And then you participate in real life. Always looking for feedback. Too much, too little, too soon? This is how people behave normally. What I'm suggesting is that self-development needs to work with that also. So the question was, what about, if you're out there too much, you can be hurt. That is true. Don't be out there too much. Be more out than you have been. Do it in stages. Do it in steps. Get support for those steps. Find a group of people you can talk to. This is what I would term being in process. And by that I mean that we don't hatch an idea full-flown. I remember reading about Einstein. There's a series on genius that has been intriguing to me. And when I would read about Einstein, I would read where he thought a long time before he came out with E = mc squared. That did not pop out of his mouth accidentally. He worked on it. He worked on it for years. And then he had insight. But that insight was based on years of work that finally crystallized in one moment. If you have done a lot of work and it seems to crystallize and you have an aha and you enact it in the world, there will be feedback. And the feedback will tell you whether perhaps you got it wrong or not, or whether it needs to be modified or not. Now, when Einstein said E = mc squared, a lot of people said, you're an idiot. What are you talking about? Mathematicians. You've got to be crazy. So feedback by itself isn't necessarily a reflection of whether you're being honest and truthful to your nature and whether your insight is correct or not. I'm trying to use this in a non-dualistic way, the word correct. But it's up to you to evaluate that feedback. So here I am putting out a presentation, and this presentation is going to go on YouTube, and I absolutely know some people are going to say, she doesn't know what she's talking about. I cannot understand a word she says. And It can pick apart any specific thing that I say. While all that may be true, I also need to look at the feedback from people who have read the lectures and who are making a more relevant analysis of whether I'm presenting points reasonably well. So there is a range of feedback, and it's my job to decide what grains of truth those different feedback, that was a very confusing sentence. Let me take that back and start over. It's up to me to decide what elements of that feedback have truth and whether I wish to change because of it. Someone may say something that's true, but I may decide it's not relevant. So I think you're talking about jumping out into the world, let's say, jumping out into the world stark naked and saying, here I am. And people say, oh, cover up. You need to be aware of your audience. It may be true what you do and say, but your audience may not be prepared for it. So what they taught me in management was that communication is about saying something and finding out what the other person heard. Feedback is a way of finding out what they heard. If you get feedback that says this is absolutely wrong, that's part of communication. So if you make yourself overly vulnerable, the fact that you are just, I know that this is not specific to you, but in your description of the question, by making yourself overly vulnerable, you already know that you were overly vulnerable. So there's an inner knowing when we have overstepped a line or gone too far. And the importance is to listen to the inner message. Part of what Pathwork is doing is it's trying to help you create a clean filter. It's trying to help you see the bias that you already have in your life. In the beginning, I read about these forcing currents and these life decisions made in childhood that happen today. Think of those as prejudices and biases. When you're trying to self-analyze, those bad filters are going to get in your way. Pathwork is more about cleaning up your filters than telling you what to do. I want to check in with you. Elenisi, does that answer your question?
Yes, Jen, was very good. Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Anyone else before we close this section? There's a time delay when people are finding the unmute button. Okay. If you've been watching the video, thank you for your patience. Thank you for your interest in Pathwork. To learn more about the lectures and to explore more about yourself.